I spent 79 years tired, and I finally found out why. What I discovered will change everything you think about sacrifice, family, and your own health. By the end of this story, you'll never ignore your own needs again. At 79, I finally understood why I was always tired, and it wasn't the kind of tired that sleep could fix. For years, I had blamed my age, my bones, my slowing steps, the way mornings felt heavier than they used to. I told myself this was what growing old looked like, waking up already worn out, carrying a quiet ache in the chest, feeling as though life itself required more effort than I had left to give. Doctors called it normal aging. Friends nodded knowingly when I mentioned it. Even my children would say, gently but firmly, "You're almost 80, Mama. Of course you're tired." And I accepted that explanation because it was simple, because it didn't require me to look too closely at the truth I had been avoiding. But the tiredness I felt was deeper than my muscles. It lived behind my eyes. It settled in my spirit. It followed me even on days when I hadn't done much at all. I could sit in a chair all afternoon, sunlight spilling through the window, and still feel as though I had run a long race without ever moving forward. That kind of tiredness is hard to explain to people who haven't lived it. It's not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It just stays, quietly draining you day after day. I remember one morning clearly, more clearly than most. I was standing in my kitchen, holding a cup of tea I had already reheated twice. The kettle clicked off again, and I realized I had forgotten why I was standing there in the first place. Not in a worrying medical way, but in a foggy way, like my mind was constantly occupied with something else, something unfinished, something unresolved. I leaned against the counter and sighed, a long sigh that came from somewhere deeper than my lungs, and for the first time a thought surfaced that startled me. I am tired of being needed. The thought felt almost shameful. I had spent my entire life being needed. As a young woman, I was needed by my husband, by my children, by my parents, by neighbors, by the church, by anyone who sensed I would say yes before they even finished asking. Being needed had given my life structure and purpose. It told me who I was: a good woman, a reliable woman, a loving mother, a patient wife. I wore those labels proudly, like medals earned through quiet endurance. I never questioned whether there was a cost to carrying them for so long. When my children were young, tiredness made sense. I was up at night with fevers and bad dreams. I packed lunches, washed uniforms, listened to worries that felt enormous to small hearts. I told myself, this is love. And it was. I don't regret those years, not for a moment. But love back then came with an end-of-day exhaustion that was honest and deserved. You slept, you woke up, and you began again. This tiredness was different. This tiredness followed me into rest. It sat beside me even when the house was quiet. It whispered to me when I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering why I still felt responsible for everyone's comfort, everyone's peace, everyone's happiness, long after my hands had done all the work they were ever asked to do. My children are grown now. They have homes, careers, families of their own. They are good people, kind people, busy people. And still, somehow, I remained the one who checked in first, who adjusted plans, who swallowed disappointments so no one else would feel uncomfortable. If a call went unanswered, I worried. If a visit was postponed, I reassured them. If they sounded stressed, I softened my voice, even when I was the one who needed gentleness. I told myself that this was just what mothers do, even at 79, especially at 79. But my body was trying to tell me something my pride refused to hear. Every ache, every heavy morning, every afternoon where I needed to lie down, not because I was weak, but because I was empty, it was all adding up to a message I had ignored for decades. One afternoon, not long before my birthday, my daughter called. She was distracted, half listening, juggling responsibilities on her end. I was telling her about a small pain in my chest, not fearfully, just honestly. She paused for a moment and then said, kindly but quickly, "You worry too much, Mom. Try to relax." And just like that, the conversation moved on. After we hung up, I sat very still. I didn't cry. I didn't feel angry. I felt invisible, not unloved, not abandoned, just unseen in a way that left me strangely hollow. And in that silence, something inside me shifted. I realized that for years I had been carrying not only my own worries, but everyone else's as well, long after they had stopped carrying mine. That was when the tiredness finally made sense. It wasn't my age that had worn me down. It was emotional labor without rest, love without boundaries, responsibility without release. I had never learned how to put myself down gently. I had never learned that being a good mother did not mean being endlessly available. I had never learned that care, when given without limits, slowly turns into depletion. And at 79, my body, faithful as it had always been, was finally forcing me to listen. That night, as I lay in bed, I didn't ask myself how much longer I had left. I asked myself a different question, one that felt both terrifying and freeing. What would happen if I stopped carrying what was no longer mine to hold? I didn't have the answer yet, but for the first time in many years, I understood the question. And that understanding, that quiet, late-life clarity, was the beginning of everything that came next. Once the question had settled inside me, what would happen if I stopped carrying what was no longer mine to hold? It refused to leave. It followed me through the small routines of my days, lingering in the pauses between tasks, rising up when I least expected it. I noticed it while folding laundry that no one would notice was folded. I felt it while preparing meals that were mostly eaten alone. I heard it in the silence after phone calls ended too quickly. The tiredness, I realized, was not new. It had simply grown quieter over the years, folding itself into the shape of my life so neatly that I mistook it for normal. When I looked back honestly, I could trace its beginnings far beyond motherhood, far beyond marriage. I had been tired long before my hair turned gray. I had been tired when I was young and capable and told myself that exhaustion was the price of being good. As a girl, I learned early that praise came when I made myself useful, when I was accommodating, when I didn't complain. I was the child who stayed out of the way, who sensed tension before words were spoken, who learned how to smooth things over without being asked. No one taught me that directly. I absorbed it quietly, the way children do, through tone, through glances, through the subtle rewards given to those who make life easier for others. By the time I became a woman, that skill had hardened into identity. I wasn't just someone who helped. I was someone who felt uneasy when I wasn't helping. Rest felt undeserved. Saying no felt selfish. I measured my worth by how much I could carry without letting it show. And when I married, that way of being slipped effortlessly into place. I loved my husband deeply. He was not unkind, but like many men of his time, he leaned without noticing how much weight he placed on me. I became the quiet center of everything, the organizer, the emotional anchor, the one who remembered, adjusted, endured. When the children arrived, the exhaustion deepened, but also found its justification. Mothers are supposed to be tired, I told myself. This is what devotion looks like. I didn't just care for my children's needs, I anticipated them. I felt responsible not only for their safety, but for their moods, their disappointments, their futures. If they were unhappy, I assumed I had failed somewhere. If they struggled, I searched myself for the reason. I didn't know how to love without absorbing. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from always being emotionally alert, from never fully relaxing into your own life because you are listening for the needs of others. I lived in that state for decades. Even moments of joy carried an undercurrent of vigilance. Was everyone comfortable? Was everyone okay? Was there something I should be doing? And when the house finally grew quieter as the children grew up and moved away, that vigilance didn't leave. It had nowhere to go. So it turned inward, becoming a constant hum of low-level worry that never completely shut off. At 79, I could see it clearly for the first time. I had never allowed myself to be held. I had never learned how to lean. I had been so busy being strong, being reliable, being the one others counted on, that I forgot how to ask what I needed, or whether I needed anything at all. The tiredness I felt was not just from giving too much, it was from never receiving without guilt. I thought about all the times I said I was fine when I wasn't. All the times I softened my voice so others wouldn't feel burdened. All the moments I swallowed my loneliness because it felt inappropriate to speak it out loud. I realized how often I dismissed my own feelings before anyone else had the chance to. How I had become my own harshest minimizer. And perhaps the most painful realization of all was this: the people I loved had not asked me to disappear. I had done that myself, quietly, over time, not out of weakness, but out of a belief I had never questioned, that love meant making yourself smaller so others could be comfortable. That belief had shaped my entire life, and now, at an age when many expect only decline, it was asking to be examined. I noticed how my body responded when I entertained the idea of doing less, of expecting less from myself. My shoulders dropped slightly. My breathing softened. It was subtle but unmistakable. My body, it seemed, was ready for rest long before my mind had allowed it. The exhaustion was not asking me to push harder. It was asking me to stop. I began to understand that my tiredness was not a failure of strength, but a signal of imbalance, a message that I had lived too long in one direction, that I had loved generously but forgotten that love, to be sustainable, must include the self, that even the most devoted heart eventually needs permission to be cared for. This realization did not come with instant relief. It came with grief. Grief for the years I spent believing that my value was tied to how much I could endure. Grief for the softness I denied myself. Grief for the rest I postponed again and again, always telling myself later. Later had arrived. And standing there, in the quiet of my 79th year, I understood something both heavy and hopeful. The tiredness was not the end of me. It was the beginning of a long overdue honesty, an invitation to finally ask not just who needs me, but who am I when I am not needed? That question scared me, but it also lit a small, steady warmth in my chest, one that felt, for the first time in a long while, like the possibility of true rest. Once the understanding settled in, Once I could no longer pretend that my tiredness was just age or circumstance, it began to quietly rearrange my days. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, almost invisible ways that felt both unfamiliar and strangely relieving. Awareness, I learned, does not shout, it whispers, and once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. The first changes were so subtle that no one around me noticed. I noticed, though. I noticed the pause before I agreed to things automatically, the moment of silence where I used to rush to reassure. I noticed how my body hesitated now, as if asking permission before moving forward. For the first time in my life, I began listening to that hesitation instead of overriding it. One afternoon, my phone rang while I was sitting by the window, enjoying the way the light rested on the floor. Normally, I would have answered immediately, heart already preparing itself to be useful, but this time I let it ring. Not out of anger, not out of defiance, simply because I didn't want to interrupt the quiet I was finally learning to feel. When the ringing stopped, I expected guilt to rush in. It always had before. Instead, there was only calm. That startled me more than anything. It was then I realized how much of my exhaustion had come from urgency that was never truly necessary. I had lived as if everything required immediate response, immediate fixing, immediate availability. But the world did not collapse when I slowed down. No one was harmed by my pause. Life continued, unbothered by my small act of restraint. With that realization came others. I stopped explaining myself so thoroughly. I noticed how often I had justified my choices, my needs, even my fatigue, as if they required approval. One evening, when asked why I couldn't visit on short notice, I simply said, "I'm tired today." I didn't add a reason, I didn't soften it with laughter, I didn't promise to make it up later. The sentence felt unfinished in my mouth, but also complete. The quiet consequence of that moment arrived later when no argument followed, no disappointment voiced aloud, no reprimand, just acceptance. And with that acceptance came an unexpected truth. Much of the pressure I felt had been maintained by my own fear of disapproval, not by actual demands placed upon me. That truth was unsettling. It meant that the exhaustion I carried was not solely inherited from others, it was sustained by habits I had never questioned. Habits built from love, yes, but also from fear. Fear of being less needed, fear of being less loved, fear of being seen as difficult instead of dependable. As I began to live with this awareness, I noticed how my days stretched differently. Time felt wider, slower. I spent mornings without rushing through them. I drank my tea while it was still hot. I sat longer in silence without feeling the need to fill it with productivity. These were small things, but they carried weight. They felt like reclamation. There were moments, though, when the old patterns tried to reassert themselves, when I felt the familiar tug of obligation tighten in my chest, when guilt arrived uninvited, whispering that rest was indulgence, that boundaries were selfish. I did not banish those thoughts. I acknowledged them. I had lived with them for decades. They deserved recognition, if not obedience. Instead of pushing myself past discomfort, I began asking a new question. What happens if I don't? And slowly, I discovered the answer. Nothing terrible happened. The world did not withdraw its love. The people I cared for adjusted, and I, astonishingly, felt lighter. The quiet consequences of this shift were not always comfortable. Some people noticed the change before I named it myself.
They remarked that I seemed different, quieter, less eager. I heard curiosity in their voices, sometimes confusion. Once, someone asked if everything was all right. I smiled and said, "Yes, I'm just listening to myself more." That answer surprised both of us. Listening to myself meant acknowledging desires I had long dismissed. It meant admitting when I wanted solitude instead of company, when I preferred peace over harmony, when I chose stillness over service. These choices did not come naturally. They felt awkward, like wearing new shoes that hadn't yet shaped to my feet. But with time, they began to fit. I also noticed something else, something tender and unexpected. As I conserved my energy, I became more present in the moments I did choose to give. I listened more deeply. I spoke more honestly. I was less resentful because I was no longer overextended. My love, once spread thin by obligation, began to feel deliberate again. This, too, had consequences, quiet ones, good ones. Conversations felt less hurried. My laughter felt less forced. I no longer gave from depletion. I gave from fullness. And that difference, though subtle, changed the texture of my relationships. There were evenings when I sat alone and felt a pang of sadness, not loneliness exactly, but the grief of realizing how long I had lived without asking myself what I needed. That grief did not undo the peace I was building. It softened it. It reminded me that growth often arrives holding both relief and regret. At 79, I was not reinventing my life. I was refining it, trimming away what drained me, making room for what sustained me. The emotional shift that began with understanding my exhaustion was now quietly shaping my days, one small choice at a time. And perhaps the most profound consequence of all was this. For the first time, my life felt like it belonged to me, not because I had taken it from anyone else, but because I had finally stopped giving it away without question. The tiredness had not disappeared completely, but it had changed. It was no longer heavy with resentment or confusion. It was honest. It told me when to rest, when to stop, when to choose myself without apology. And in listening to it, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in years, something gentle, steady, and deeply reassuring. I felt at home in my own presence. It was only a matter of time before the changes inside me began to show themselves on the outside. When you live quietly for long enough in a certain role, people come to rely on the predictability of you. They don't question it. They don't examine it. They simply expect it. And when you begin to shift, even gently, it is noticed. At first, the responses were small, subtle hesitations in conversations, pauses where there hadn't been any before, a slight narrowing of the eyes when I didn't respond as quickly as I used to. I recognized these signs because I had once worn them myself, those expressions of surprise when someone steps out of the place you unconsciously assigned them. One afternoon, a family gathering was planned with the same unspoken assumption that had existed for years, that I would handle the details, the food, the timing, the emotional smoothing. When I mentioned, calmly, without drama, that I wouldn't be managing everything this time, the room fell quiet. Not angry quiet, confused quiet, as if I had spoken in a language no one expected me to know. Someone laughed softly, assuming I was joking. Someone else asked if I wasn't feeling well. And then came the familiar concern wrapped in politeness. "Are you sure? You've always done it." That sentence stayed with me. You've always done it. As if the past were a contract, as if consistency were a debt owed forever. I felt the old instinct rise, the urge to reassure, to backtrack, to soften my boundary until it disappeared. Instead, I took a breath and said, "I know, I just can't this time." My voice didn't shake, but inside something held its breath. The reaction was not explosive. It didn't need to be. Discomfort is often quieter than anger. It lingers. It rearranges the atmosphere. Some people adjusted immediately, stepping into roles I had long occupied without complaint. Others grew distant, uncertain how to relate to this version of me that no longer rushed to fill every gap. I learned then that understanding does not always arrive quickly, even from those who love us. Some responses were warm, even relieving. A few people told me they admired my honesty. One quietly admitted they had never realized how much I carried. Those moments felt like gentle hands on my back, steadying me as I learned to stand differently. But there was resistance, too. Not loud resistance, emotional resistance, the kind that comes in the form of disappointment masked as concern, of questions that weren't really questions at all. Why now? What changed? Is something wrong? Each one seemed to ask the same thing beneath the surface. Why are you no longer who we expect you to be? I answered some of them. Others I let pass. I was learning that not every feeling someone has requires my explanation or repair. That realization was both freeing and unsettling. I had spent a lifetime translating myself so others would be comfortable. Now I was allowing a little discomfort to exist without rushing to erase it.
As the days passed, I noticed something else. The more consistent I was with my boundaries, the clearer my sense of self became. It was as if every small act of choosing myself sharpened the outline of who I was becoming. I was no longer defined solely by what I provided. I was defined by what I valued. This clarity did not make me colder, it made me steadier. I listened without absorbing. I cared without collapsing. When someone expressed frustration, I let it belong to them instead of carrying it as my responsibility. That was new, and not everyone welcomed it. There were moments of doubt, quiet nights when I replayed conversations in my head, wondering if I had been too firm, too distant, too changed. Guilt still visited me, especially when I sensed someone pulling away. But alongside that guilt was a growing certainty, one that whispered that I could not continue living at the cost of myself. The most difficult responses came from those closest to me. They had known me longest. They had benefited most from my self-erasure, even if unintentionally. When I stopped anticipating their needs before they voiced them, it unsettled them. When I said no without apology, it confused them. When I chose rest over availability, it challenged the version of me they had come to rely on. One conversation in particular stayed with me. A loved one asked, not unkindly, "Don't you care anymore?" The question pierced me, not because it was cruel, but because it revealed how deeply my worth had been tied to sacrifice. I answered slowly, choosing my words with care. "I care," I said. "I just don't disappear anymore to prove it." That was the moment I felt my self-definition settle more firmly inside me. Love, I realized, does not require self-abandonment. Care does not demand exhaustion, and boundaries are not walls. They are shapes that allow relationships to exist without consuming one another. Some people adapted, others didn't, and I learned to accept both outcomes without seeing either as failure. Growth rearranges relationships. It reveals which ones can stretch and which ones were held together by imbalance. With time, the resistance softened, or perhaps I simply became less reactive to it. Either way, I no longer measured my choices by how smoothly they were received. I measured them by how honestly they aligned with who I was becoming. At 79, this self-definition did not arrive with declarations or reinvention. It arrived quietly, through repetition, through choosing rest again and again, through honoring my limits even when it felt awkward, through trusting that my value did not diminish when I stopped overgiving. And slowly, the world around me adjusted, not because I forced it to, but because I no longer bent myself to fit it. I was still loving, still present, still deeply connected, but I was no longer invisible within those connections. I was there, fully, defined not by obligation, but by intention. And in that definition, something remarkable happened. I began to feel whole, not because everyone understood my change, but because I finally did. Acceptance did not arrive all at once. It didn't announce itself. It didn't feel like relief at first. It felt more like space, an unfamiliar openness where constant self-questioning used to live. For most of my life, I had mistaken apology for kindness, guilt for responsibility. Now, as I moved through my days with fewer explanations, I began to notice how often I had apologized simply for existing with needs of my own. At first, the guilt lingered like a shadow that followed me everywhere. It appeared in quiet moments, when I rested instead of helping, when I declined instead of agreeing, when I chose solitude over service. Even in stillness, I could hear the old internal voice asking, "Are you being selfish? Are you letting people down? Are you becoming someone you never meant to be?" But something had changed. I no longer answered that voice immediately. I let the questions sit without rushing to resolve them. And in that pause, I discovered something unexpected. The guilt weakened when it wasn't fed. It needed my attention to survive. When I stopped justifying myself internally, it began to loosen its hold. Acceptance began in the smallest ways. I accepted that not everyone would understand my choices. I accepted that discomfort was part of growth, not a signal to retreat. I accepted that caring deeply did not require constant availability. These truths didn't feel empowering at first. They felt heavy, but they were honest. And honesty, I was learning, is a quieter form of strength. There were moments when the guilt tried to return, dressed in familiar clothing, a look of disappointment, a delayed phone call, a silence where appreciation used to be. Each one tugged at me, tempting me to return to old patterns, to overcompensate, to explain myself back into exhaustion. But I noticed something else too. The more I stayed steady, the less dramatic these moments became. They passed. Life continued. Relationships adjusted. The imagined consequences I had feared for decades, rejection, abandonment, irrelevance, never truly arrived. And that realization was both humbling and liberating. I began to understand that much of my exhaustion had come from anticipating reactions that never actually occurred. I had lived as if every boundary would break something fragile. In reality, most things bent, some even strengthened. With acceptance came a softer rhythm to my days. I woke without the immediate sense of urgency that used to grip me. I moved through tasks without layering them with emotional labor. I allowed myself to enjoy things without feeling the need to earn them through sacrifice. These changes were subtle, but they accumulated into something meaningful. The freedom that emerged was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet. It felt like breathing without restriction, like walking without constantly scanning for who might need me next. I noticed how my shoulders rested lower, how my thoughts were less crowded, how my energy, though still limited by age, felt more like my own. One afternoon, I sat alone in the late sunlight, doing nothing particularly useful.
In the past, this would have filled me with unease. I would have searched for a reason to justify the stillness. But this time, I let it be. And in that moment, I felt a deep, unearned peace. Not the kind that comes from completing a task, but the kind that comes from no longer measuring your worth by productivity or sacrifice. I began to forgive myself, not in a dramatic, ceremonial way, but in everyday decisions. Each time I chose rest without explanation, I forgave myself. Each time I allowed someone else to manage their own disappointment, I forgave myself. Each time I resisted the urge to prove my love through exhaustion, I forgave myself. The guilt didn't disappear overnight. It softened. It became quieter. It visited less often. And when it did appear, I greeted it differently. I no longer treated it as a command. I treated it as a memory, a habit formed in a time when survival required self-erasure. Acceptance also meant recognizing the limits of my past. I began to see my younger self with compassion rather than judgment. She did what she knew. She gave what she had. She believed love meant endurance. I didn't blame her anymore. I thanked her and gently released her methods. There was a growing sense that I had entered a new season of life. Not one defined by decline, but by refinement. I was no longer expanding outward, proving myself through effort. I was narrowing inward, choosing carefully what deserved my remaining energy. That choice felt sacred. People noticed the change, even if they couldn't name it. Some commented that I seemed calmer. Others said I seemed different, though they couldn't explain how. I didn't correct them. I didn't need to. The shift was not for display. It was for survival, for dignity, for peace. The deeper freedom that took shape was not freedom from responsibility, but freedom from obligation that drained the soul. I still cared. I still showed up, but I did so from a place of choice, not compulsion, and that difference changed everything. At 79, I was not becoming less loving. I was becoming more honest. And honesty, I discovered, creates space for a truer kind of connection, one that doesn't require losing yourself to maintain it. As acceptance settled in, I realized something that surprised me. I was no longer tired in the same way. My body still aged, my energy still ebbed, but the deep, lifelong exhaustion, the kind that comes from emotional overextension, had begun to lift. I was still learning, still adjusting, but I was no longer apologizing for existing as I was. And in that quiet freedom, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. I felt light. Something shifted quietly after acceptance settled in. The boundaries I had once braced myself to defend no longer felt like walls I had to stand guard beside. They began to feel more like doorways, open when I chose, closed when I needed rest. I stopped rehearsing explanations in my head. I stopped preparing myself for resistance that rarely came. What surprised me most was not how others responded, but how my own body responded when I no longer lived in a constant state of readiness. For years, boundaries had felt like confrontation. I associated them with tension, with raised voices or wounded silence. Setting one always came with an internal battle. Is this worth the discomfort? Will this change how they see me? Now those questions arrived less frequently, and when they did, they no longer dictated my choices. I had learned, slowly and imperfectly, that boundaries were not a rejection of love. They were a definition of it. I began to notice how natural it felt to say simple things without embellishment. I can't today. I need rest. That doesn't work for me. Each sentence landed softly without the old tremor. I didn't feel the need to soften them with apologies or explanations, and the world didn't collapse. Relationships didn't shatter. The fear I had carried for decades, fear that my worth depended on constant accommodation, began to dissolve. With this change came a strengthening of identity. I started to recognize myself not by what I provided, but by who I was when I was quiet and alone. I noticed my preferences again, small ones at first, the time of day I liked to walk, the music that soothed me, the way I preferred my tea. These details might seem insignificant, but for someone who had spent a lifetime orienting herself around others, they were revelations. I realized how long it had been since I had asked myself simple questions without guilt. What do I want today? What feels right for me? Not what was expected, not what was efficient, just what felt honest. Answering those questions felt like reconnecting with a voice I had muted long ago. Peace, once borrowed from moments of approval or temporary calm, began to feel rooted. It didn't disappear when someone was displeased. It didn't evaporate when I chose myself. It stayed, quietly, steadily, like a presence I could rely on rather than something I had to earn. There were still moments of discomfort. Boundaries did not erase complexity. Sometimes someone would push back. Sometimes a silence would linger longer than expected. But I noticed how differently I held those moments now. I no longer internalized them as failures. I no longer rushed to fix what might not need fixing. I allowed others the dignity of their reactions, just as I allowed myself the dignity of my needs.
This shift changed how I saw my past as well. I stopped framing my life as a series of sacrifices and began to see it as a continuum of choices, some made from love, some from fear, many from habit. I didn't rewrite history to absolve myself, nor did I condemn myself for what I didn't know then. I let my story be complex, human, incomplete. As my identity strengthened, I felt less urgency to be understood. I didn't need to convince anyone of my reasons. I didn't need to justify my pace. I trusted myself more. And trust, I discovered, is what gives boundaries their strength. Without trust, boundaries feel brittle. With it, they feel organic, an extension of self-respect rather than a shield. Peace also began to settle into my body. I slept more deeply. I woke without the old heaviness pressing on my chest. My thoughts moved more slowly, less urgently. I wasn't constantly scanning my day for obligations or potential disappointments. I was present in a way I hadn't been before, present with my surroundings, with my memories, with myself. There was a moment one evening when I realized I had gone an entire day without feeling that familiar, unnamed fatigue. Not physical tiredness, but the emotional weariness that used to cling to me like a second skin. It startled me. I had lived so long believing that exhaustion was simply part of who I was. To experience a day without it felt like stepping into a life I didn't know I was allowed to have. I also noticed how my relationships subtly recalibrated. Some became quieter, less demanding. Others grew more genuine. When I did show up, I was more present because I wasn't depleted. My words carried more weight because they weren't rushed or resentful. Love, stripped of obligation, felt cleaner, freer. Identity, I learned, is not something you declare. It's something you live into. Each boundary reinforced who I was becoming. Each choice aligned with my inner truth added another layer of stability. I was no longer performing a version of myself shaped by expectation. I was inhabiting myself. Peace no longer felt like a temporary visitor. It felt like a resident. It stayed with me through small conflicts, through misunderstandings, through ordinary days. It didn't require perfect circumstances. It simply required my willingness to remain anchored in myself. At 79, I understood that peace is not the absence of demands, it is the presence of self-respect. And self-respect, once established, does not ask permission to exist. I wasn't guarding my boundaries anymore, I was living within them. And for the first time in a very long while, that space felt like home. When the noise of obligation finally softened, something unexpected rose to the surface. Questions about what would remain of me when I was gone. Not in the dramatic sense of inheritance or possessions, but in the quieter, more enduring way. What had I taught through the way I lived? What had my children learned, not just from my words, but from my silences, my endurance, my constant availability? For most of my life, I believed love was proven through sacrifice, that the depth of my care could be measured by how much of myself I was willing to give away. I wore that belief like a badge of honor. It made the exhaustion feel noble. It justified the loneliness. It explained why my needs always came last. But now, at 79, with peace finally settling into my bones, I began to question whether that definition of love had truly served any of us. Legacy, I realized, is not what we leave behind. It is what we model while we are here. And what had I modeled? A woman who was always tired, a woman who rarely rested without guilt, a woman who loved deeply but disappeared quietly inside that love. It was a painful recognition, not because I felt ashamed, but because I understood how invisible those lessons had been while I was living them. This realization brought me to self-forgiveness, a place I had never truly visited. Forgiveness had always been something I extended outward, to children, to family, to circumstances. I was generous with it, but I had rarely turned it inward. I had been harsh with myself, measuring my worth by my usefulness, my patience by my silence. I had blamed myself for feeling tired, as if exhaustion were a personal failure rather than a consequence of decades spent ignoring my own limits. Forgiving myself did not mean pretending I had done everything right. It meant acknowledging that I did the best I could with the understanding I had at the time. I did not know then what I know now. I did not have language for boundaries or models for balance or permission to rest. I was living inside a story passed down to me, a story where good mothers were tireless, where love meant endurance, where self-denial was praised as virtue. Letting go of that story felt like releasing a weight I had carried for so long that I no longer noticed its presence. With self-forgiveness came compassion for the younger version of me who believed she had to earn love through sacrifice. I began to see her not as weak or misguided, but as loyal. Loyal to her children, loyal to her values, loyal to the idea of love she had been taught. As this compassion grew, so did my understanding of love beyond sacrifice. Love, I was learning, does not require self-erasure. It does not demand exhaustion as proof. It does not grow stronger when one person disappears so others can flourish. True love, the kind that sustains rather than depletes, allows everyone involved to remain whole. This shift changed how I viewed my relationships with my children. I no longer felt the need to rewrite the past or explain myself. Instead, I focused on the present, on showing them a version of love that included self-respect. When I said no, I was teaching them that love has limits. When I rested, I was showing them that care begins within. When I chose peace, I was offering them a different inheritance, one rooted not in obligation, but in balance. There were moments when I wondered if it was too late for these lessons to matter. After all, my children were grown, their habits were formed, their lives were full.
But legacy is not bound by age. It unfolds in moments, small, quiet moments, where a different way of being is witnessed. And even if these lessons never fully took root in them, they matter deeply to me. Self-forgiveness also brought relief from an old, persistent guilt, the guilt of wanting something for myself. For years, any desire that did not directly benefit others felt indulgent. Now, I allowed myself small joys without justification. A slow morning, a walk without purpose, a day where nothing was required of me. These moments were not acts of rebellion, they were acts of restoration. I began to understand that loving others well does not mean abandoning oneself. In fact, love that demands self-abandonment often breeds resentment, even when unspoken. I had felt that resentment before, buried beneath layers of duty. Now, without the weight of sacrifice pressing down on me, love felt lighter, more honest, less performative. Legacy, self-forgiveness, and love began to weave together into a new understanding of my life. I was no longer measuring my worth by how much I had given up. I was measuring it by how fully I had finally arrived in myself. This did not diminish the love I had for my children, it clarified it. Love, freed from sacrifice, became something shared rather than surrendered. There was a quiet pride that emerged, not pride in endurance, but pride in growth. I had lived long enough to unlearn what no longer served me. I had found the courage to redefine love at an age when many believe change is no longer possible. That, I realized, was a legacy worth leaving. At 79, I understood that love does not ask us to disappear. It asks us to remain, present, whole, and honest. And perhaps the greatest gift I could leave behind was not the story of how much I gave up, but the example of how I finally chose to stay.
As the years gently carried me forward, I began to notice subtle shifts that only time can bring. Time has a way of softening the sharp edges of long-held roles, edges carved by expectation, duty, and habit. The mother who once moved like a shadow behind every decision, silently sacrificing for her children, was no longer the only version of me. I could see myself in sunlight now, unhurried, no longer shrinking to fit into the corners of others' lives. The quiet power of that change revealed itself slowly in ways both small and profound, as if the world itself had adjusted to the rhythm I finally allowed myself to keep. Relationships, too, began to reshape themselves, not through grand gestures or forced conversations, but through the subtle realignment of energy. My children, having grown accustomed to my ceaseless availability, were initially unsure of this new boundary. Some resisted, testing the limits I had only recently discovered, while others hesitated with tender curiosity, watching for signs that I might return to my old ways. And yet, as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the tension began to dissolve. My steadiness, the quiet insistence that I could love fully while honoring myself, taught them something that words could not, that respect is reciprocal, that presence is powerful, and that care need not come at the expense of one's soul. This was not a swift transformation. It was measured, almost imperceptible at times. I watched as old arguments fell into silence, not because they were avoided, but because they no longer carried the same weight. My children began to engage with me differently, not with entitlement, but with appreciation and curiosity. They began to ask for advice less as a demand and more as a request, as if the invisible pressure to extract my energy had finally eased. I felt a lightness I had never known, the kind that arises when the roles that have constrained you for decades start to loosen, leaving room for genuine connection rather than obligation.
I noticed the ripple of peace beyond the walls of our home as well. Friends who had long admired my endurance began to see something different. A woman who had learned that caring for herself was not weakness, but wisdom. Family gatherings transformed subtly. I spoke with confidence, laughed freely, and allowed myself moments of stillness without apology. The energy I had long invested in performing sacrifice now flowed naturally into warmth and presence. People responded to that authenticity, drawn not to a version of me filtered by duty, but to the whole, vibrant human person who finally existed without compromise. The days of self-imposed invisibility had taught me a painful yet invaluable lesson. Peace that is borrowed, snatched from fleeting moments, or hidden in brief respites can never be enough. Real peace, the kind that endures beyond the moment, requires courage, patience, and the steady reinforcement of boundaries. I had arrived at this truth through trial and reflection, but its rewards were immediate and tangible. Each morning I woke with a sense of anticipation for the day, not because tasks demanded me, but because life itself felt open and unclaimed. The world did not shrink around me. I expanded into it.
As peace began to ripple outward, I noticed subtle, almost miraculous changes in my children. The daughter who had always been critical began to speak with more gentleness. She noticed when I smiled without reason and asked how I felt, not just what I could do for her. The son who had once expected me to anticipate his every need began to check in, asking, "Are you resting?" with genuine concern rather than casual politeness. These small gestures, easily overlooked, became profound symbols of mutual respect. It was as if by claiming my own space and honoring my own rhythm, I had created a permission slip for them to do the same, an unspoken but transformative lesson in empathy and self-care. I also recognized that my peace was contagious, but not in a way that imposed or demanded. It did not pressure others to change. It simply existed as a quiet, luminous presence that invited reflection. At family dinners, there were fewer arguments over trivial matters. Conversations lingered longer, allowing space for listening rather than correction. In casual visits, laughter emerged more naturally, and silences no longer carried tension, they carried comfort. I had almost imperceptibly shifted the emotional climate around me, not by force, but by living with integrity and self-respect. This ripple extended beyond my immediate family. Friends, neighbors, and even casual acquaintances responded to the calm I carried. I found that I could hold my opinions without needing to defend them, express my desires without guilt, and say no without fear of reprisal. The energy I once spent in performing self-denial was now available for generosity, kindness, and meaningful engagement. And in these exchanges, I discovered something even more profound, the strength of presence. Not the presence that bends to everyone else's expectations, but the presence of someone who is fully themselves and in being so enriches everyone around them. By the time I turned 80, the transformation was unmistakable. I could look back on decades of sacrifice and struggle without bitterness, seeing each choice as a necessary step toward this moment of clarity. The legacy I was leaving was no longer simply about raising competent, successful children. It was about modeling a life where self-respect and love coexist. I had learned, finally, that love does not demand depletion, that boundaries are not barriers, but bridges to healthier connection, that the quiet strength of one person living fully can ripple outward, influencing hearts and lives far beyond what any single individual could imagine. In the softening of old roles, in the gentle reshaping of relationships, I discovered a truth I had long ignored. The power to transform a family, and perhaps even the world, lies not in sacrifice, but in authenticity. By honoring myself, I had given my children a gift far greater than any material inheritance.
I had shown them that life is to be lived fully, that love is to be shared without erasing oneself, and that peace, once claimed, can extend far beyond the walls of a single home. In this rippling peace, I found a joy that was quiet but unwavering, a satisfaction that was complete, and a love that needed no proof because it was already whole. By the time I reached the later years of my life, there was a clarity I had never known in my youth or even my middle age, a quiet, steady illumination that came from truly choosing myself. For decades, my identity had been filtered through the expectations of others, my children, my spouse, my extended family, and the unspoken societal pressures that told me my value was measured by how much I gave, how much I sacrificed, and how tirelessly I performed love. I had moved through life with a sense of duty that was simultaneously noble and exhausting, believing that the only way to prove my devotion was to lose myself in the service of others. But now, standing at the edge of 80, I could finally look back and see with a quiet, unflinching honesty what all that effort had truly cost and what it had taught me. The cost was profound. I had neglected my own desires, postponed my own dreams, and silenced my own needs for so long that rediscovering them felt almost like learning a new language. At first, there was guilt, a familiar companion that whispered, "How could you have been so selfish? Were you abandoning your family?" But over time, that guilt began to soften, no longer sharp enough to wound, but gentle enough to remind me that self-care is not betrayal. I began to understand that choosing oneself fully is not an act of selfishness, it is an act of courage, of wisdom, and ultimately, of love. When I honored my own needs, I discovered that I could love more fully, more freely, and more authentically without the shadow of resentment clouding my relationships. Closure did not come in a single dramatic moment as though someone had waved a wand to absolve decades of self-denial. It came in quiet, almost imperceptible moments, in the way my body felt lighter when I said no without apology, in the way my mind felt calmer when I allowed myself to rest instead of endlessly perform, in the subtle but profound respect I began to receive from my children when they noticed I was no longer tethered entirely to their demands. There were no sweeping declarations, no public acknowledgments, only the gradual, persistent recognition that I had finally stepped into the fullness of my own life. That recognition was its own reward, an internal closure that required no external validation, only my willingness to see myself clearly and treat myself kindly. It was in this clarity that I began to see patterns I had been blind to for decades. I realized that my exhaustion, which it seemed like an inevitable companion throughout my adult life, was less about physical tiredness and more about the emotional drain of perpetual self-erasure. I had been running a marathon of expectation without pause, carrying the invisible weight of shoulds and musts that were never truly mine to bear. Recognizing this was liberating. I could finally disentangle my own needs from the unspoken contracts of duty and obligation, and in doing so, reclaim the energy, vitality, and enthusiasm I had long assumed were gone forever.
The quiet power of choosing oneself fully began to manifest in the ways I interacted with the world. I could offer love and guidance without desperation. I could attend family events with joy instead of obligation. I could speak my mind without fear of judgment. I could even enjoy silence, stillness, and solitude without guilt. These choices, seemingly small on the surface, carried enormous significance. They were acts of reclamation, evidence that a life lived in service to others need not obliterate the self. I realized that the most enduring gift I could give my children and family was not endless sacrifice, but the example of a whole, centered, and self-respecting person.
There were moments of resistance, of course. Some of my children struggled to adjust to this new dynamic, questioning why I was no longer constantly available, why I no longer deferred automatically, why I no longer excused their missteps at the cost of my own peace. But even these moments became lessons in mutual respect and personal responsibility. My willingness to hold firm in my boundaries while still offering love encouraged them to consider their own behaviors and to reflect on the quality of their interactions with me. I was no longer invisible, and that visibility did not alienate them. Instead, it invited a deeper, more authentic connection. I also began to recognize that choosing myself fully did not require abandoning relationships. It required approaching them with honesty, intention, and a sense of equilibrium. The old patterns of codependency, overextension, and unspoken resentment began to dissolve as I engaged with others from a place of strength rather than depletion. This clarity allowed me to experience relationships differently, not as transactions of energy and obligation, but as genuine exchanges of love, respect, and mutual care. And in this shift, I found a kind of freedom I had never imagined possible, a freedom that was quiet, profound, and enduring. In these moments of reflection, I understood that my journey was not about perfection. It was about presence, intention, and the courage to say, I matter too. The simple act of prioritizing myself, even subtly, carried with it the wisdom of decades of living, struggling, and learning. I could see now that life does not demand total self-sacrifice to demonstrate love or commitment. On the contrary, the most meaningful love is given from a place of fullness, not depletion. By fully embracing myself, I had discovered that I could offer more, not less, to those I cared about. Finally, the quiet power of choosing oneself fully was inseparable from a deep sense of gratitude. I was grateful for the lessons that life had imposed on me, for the children who challenged me, for the family and friends who witnessed my transformation, and most of all, for the resilience that allowed me to reach this point. Every hard choice, every moment of hesitation, every pang of guilt had led to this clarity. And in that clarity, I discovered peace, not borrowed, not fleeting, but enduring, grounded in the simple but profound truth that I had claimed my life for myself, and in doing so had expanded the capacity for love, understanding, and connection for everyone around me. This awareness became the cornerstone of my remaining years. It allowed me to move forward with purpose and serenity, unafraid of judgment or regret. I could look back on my life with pride, knowing that the journey had been mine to navigate, mine to choose, and mine to honor. In choosing myself fully, I had not diminished my family. I had instead created a space where love could thrive untainted by exhaustion or resentment. The final act of my life, I realized, was not about what I had given, but about how fully I had learned to live. And that lesson, quietly, powerfully, would ripple outward for generations to come. As I reached the threshold of my 80th year, I could finally see my life in its entirety, not through the fog of obligation, guilt, or expectation, but in the clear light of experience, reflection, and hard-earned wisdom. It was in these quiet moments of retrospection that the ultimate lesson crystallized before me, simple in words but profound in impact. The deepest, most lasting fulfillment does not come from pleasing others endlessly, nor from sacrificing oneself for the sake of love or duty alone. It comes from the courage to live authentically, to honor your own needs and boundaries, and to embrace the self you have nurtured through years of struggle, resilience, and quiet perseverance.
Life is not a ledger of debts paid in devotion. It is a tapestry woven from moments of presence, self-respect, and intentional love, both for others and critically for oneself. For decades, I had moved through life carrying invisible weights, the relentless expectation to give, to prioritize everyone else's happiness above my own, to erase discomfort and desire in favor of perceived duty. My exhaustion, which I once mistook for the natural course of aging, was in truth the body's quiet protest against decades of self-neglect. Looking back, I realized that the fatigue I carried was never just physical. It was the accumulation of suppressed dreams, ignored emotions, and the constant, silent erasure of self in the name of caring for others. Understanding this truth transformed everything. It was as though a veil had been lifted, revealing that the strength I had been seeking externally was always available internally, the moment I permitted myself to claim it. In claiming that strength, I discovered a freedom that was unlike anything I had ever known. It was not the boisterous freedom of rebellion, nor the fleeting thrill of indulgence. It was quieter, steadier, a freedom rooted in acceptance, discernment, and the unshakable knowledge that my value was not contingent on performance, approval, or self-effacement. I began to approach life with intention, asking myself, what do I truly need? What nourishes my spirit? Where does my joy reside? These questions, once unthinkable, became my compass. I could now make choices without fear of judgment, without guilt, without the invisible chains of past expectation. Saying no felt like saying yes to myself. Setting boundaries felt like saying yes to peace. Resting felt like saying yes to life itself. The consequences of this shift rippled outward, gently but profoundly. My children, who had once been accustomed to my constant acquiescence, now experienced me as fully present, grounded, and authentic. Some struggled at first, resistant to a version of me that would no longer silently absorb their frustrations or demands. Yet, as time passed, even resistance softened into respect, and respect gradually blossomed into a deeper, more genuine connection. They began to understand that my love was no less for the fact that it was bounded. It was more because it was conscious, intentional, and full, rather than depleting. This paradox, which had seemed impossible to me for so long, became a guiding principle. Love thrives when it is freely given, not when it is extracted from a reservoir of exhaustion. As my relationships redefined themselves, I noticed something even more extraordinary. The legacy of self-acknowledgement extended beyond personal interactions. The choices I made, small and large, echoed outward, influencing the atmosphere in our home, our family gatherings, and even my wider community. Others began to see that strength, love, and dignity need not come at the cost of self-erasure. By embodying these values, I had unintentionally gifted a blueprint for living fully, authentically, and gracefully in the later years of life. It was a living testament to the fact that even in one's late 70s and beyond, transformation is possible. Clarity can emerge, and the power to redefine one's own story remains firmly in one's own hands. Yet the most profound truth I encountered in these final chapters of reflection was perhaps the simplest. Self-love is not a luxury, it is a necessity. Without it, the love we give to others becomes incomplete, strained, or hollow. With it, love expands beyond measure, not by effort or sacrifice alone, but by presence, integrity, and authenticity. I began to understand that all the shoulds I had followed so dutifully, the expectations of family, society, and even my own internalized ideals, were not inherently wrong, but they had to be balanced with a respect for my own humanity. Choosing myself fully, embracing my own needs, and honoring my own heart was not a rejection of others, it was a redefinition of what love truly entails. In these reflections, I also found forgiveness, not just towards others, but towards myself. I forgave the years of self-neglect, the moments of resentment, the guilt that had clung to me like a shadow. I forgave myself for not seeing sooner, for not asserting my needs earlier, for mistaking self-sacrifice for virtue. This forgiveness was liberating. It lifted a weight I had carried unknowingly for decades and replaced it with a profound sense of serenity. I realized that it was never too late to reclaim your life, to reassert your value, and to live in alignment with your true self. Finally, as I sat quietly in the late afternoon light, feeling the soft pulse of life within me, I understood that the ultimate lesson of my journey was both simple and profound. The measure of a life well lived is not only the care we give others, but also the care we give ourselves. It is the harmony between self-respect and generosity, between boundaries and intimacy, between presence and obligation. It is the courage to face oneself honestly, the wisdom to honor one's own needs, and the grace to extend love without losing oneself in the process. And as I absorbed this truth fully, I felt an overwhelming peace, a peace that was not borrowed from approval, not borrowed from achievement, but cultivated from the deliberate, unflinching act of choosing myself. This peace, I realized, is the quiet inheritance we can leave behind, not material wealth, not accolades, not endless devotion, but the example that it is never too late to honor your own heart, to live authentically, and to embrace life on your own terms. It is a legacy of courage, integrity, and self-respect, one that ripples outward in ways we may never fully witness, but that endures nonetheless. And with that knowledge, I could close the chapters of my life, not with regret, not with exhaustion, but with gratitude, clarity, and the serene confidence that I had finally arrived home to myself.